Okay. Good morning and welcome to this meeting of the Committee on the Revision of the Penal Code, which is now in session. I'm Mike Romano, Committee Chair and host for this morning's activities. We are missing a few of our committee members, but they are on their way and we have a quorum, so we're going to get started. I'll begin with a roll call in alphabetical order of those who are here. Assemblymember Bryan is not here. Judge Espinoza.
I'm here.
Professor Ochin is not here. Professor Rummel.
Here.
And Senator Skinner is not here. We'll call them in once they arrive. So as usual, we have a busy agenda. We have more than 15 expert witnesses here to discuss crime prevention, intervention, and disruption with an emphasis on gun violence. We'll also take a few minutes along the way for breaks and lunch around noon. We'll close as always with public comment. I also wanted to say that this is our second meeting under the new Bagley-Keene Open Meeting Act laws that became effective this year. As a reminder, the law now requires that members of the committee, quote, visibly appear on camera during the meeting unless there are technical difficulties. So if there are technical difficulties, please let us know. Otherwise, please be on camera. Another administrative matter is before we get to any business today, I want to very warmly and heartily welcome and introduce Professor Heidi Rummel to the committee. Professor Rummel was recently appointed to the committee by Governor Newsom and directs the Post-Conviction Justice Project at USC Gould School of Law. I've known and admired Heidi for years. I am extremely proud and excited to have her join our work. I know that she's going to be a great addition to the committee. Welcome, Heidi, and thank you for all your time and energy that we're going to call on you for.
Thanks, Michael. It's an honor, privilege.
All right, great. So our topic today are policies that prevent and immediately respond to crime. This focus continues the committee's attention to public safety and services for crime victims. And we continue to strive for evidence-based policies that both improve public safety and reduce needless and racially disparate incarceration. We believe that we can do this at the same time. We're going to be covering a lot of topics today, from community violence intervention to asset forfeiture to improving public spaces that prevent crime. We're also giving special attention to gun violence, and for good reason. While California homicide rate has returned to near record low, far too many people are killed or injured by guns in California each year. I also want to point out that California's leadership role in much of what we're going to be discussing today. Some of these policies exist only in California. For example, the Armed and Prohibited Persons System, or APPS, that helps ensure firearms are removed from people who are prohibited from having them. Other programs had their genesis in California, like the Trauma Recovery Centers for Victims. And I hope that the recommendations from this committee will continue California's leadership on these problems. Before we get started, let me formally welcome and say hello to Assemblymember Isaac Bryan. Thanks for joining us, Assembly Bryan. Good to see you.
Good to see you too, Mike.
All right, let the record reflect that Assemblymember Bryan is with us. All right. Our first presentation today is from Ari Freelich. Please, I'm terrible with names. If I've mispronounced anybody's name along the way, please somebody jump in and correct me. Ari is the Director of Gun Violence Prevention at the California Department of Justice. He'll be giving us a landscape presentation of about 7 minutes on gun violence data and policies in California. He'll then also lend his expertise as a panelist in our first two panelists. So we're especially grateful to have him and giving us so much of his time today. So Ari, with that said, if you would please take it away, 7 minutes.
Good morning. I'm going to share some slides, so just one moment. Okay. Good morning. Thank you for the introduction. I have spent my career focused on legal, policy, and advocacy work centered on harm reduction and gun violence prevention, work with trauma survivors, first on mental health policy for veterans, and then as state policy director for Giffords Law Center to prevent gun violence. For the last year, I've had the privilege of serving as the first director of the California Department of Justice's newly established Office of Gun Violence Prevention, and it is an honor to be with you all today. I was invited to share a very condensed foundation-setting presentation about the landscape of gun violence prevention in California today. I'm going to share some statistics that are pulled from a series of reports that our office released in the last year. Those are available on the Office of Gun Violence Prevention website. But a few framing comments to start. We are very fortunate to live in a state that has been committed to nation-leading, informed, and effective action to address the scourge of gun violence. The governor has signed over 80 gun violence prevention bills since taking office, nearly 24 amending the penal code last year alone. As I'll discuss in a few moments, we've made really significant progress that stands clearly apart from national trends. California's gun homicide rate for youth under 25 was still higher than the rest of the United States on average as recently as 2013. Less than a decade later, California's youth gun homicide rate was about half the rate recorded for the rest of the nation on average. Gun violence is still a leading cause of death, loss, and injury in our state. But despite the significant challenges, including a ghost gun crisis and record national spikes in murders and shootings during the pandemic, we are rowing in a safer direction. And that's been especially true in two areas that will be the focus of panels later today: efforts to promote effective, permanent investments in community violence intervention programs that work to interrupt cycles of violence, trauma, and retaliation, and efforts to ensure that people who become legally disqualified from keeping firearms, such as after a domestic violence or other protection order, are effectively informed of their responsibilities, supported in compliance, and promptly, safely, and consistently separated from their weapons if they fail to relinquish them. In both of these areas, there's much more work to do to implement and build on recent reforms, replicate best practices, and transition pilot program efforts into more permanent, sustained, statewide components of our public safety infrastructure. So let's jump into some data visuals that I hope provide just a bit of a foundation for the panels to come. I'm going to move relatively quickly to try to touch upon a number of areas, so forgive me if I'm speaking quickly, and please let me know if there are any questions from the committee. I wanted to start with this graph that breaks down information about the nearly 40,000 fatal or life-threatening gunshot wound incidents in California in the 3 years from 2020 to 2022. These are the incidents that resulted in death, shown in blue, or that required serious medical attention in the form of hospitalization or emergency department care, shown in orange. As you can see, different forms of gun violence have very different odds of fatal outcomes. Over 92% of intentionally self-inflicted firearm injuries result in death, compared to 28% of intentional interpersonal shootings and 1% of unintentional shootings. As a result, if we look only at the blue, if we look only at fatalities, suicides are nearly half, not a majority, but nearly half of fatal gunshot injuries in the state of California. But a much larger number of people require serious medical attention for interpersonal shootings in particular. A key takeaway we will return to, which informs a lot of gun violence prevention policy and victim care policy, is that for every one person killed by a gun homicide in our state, about 3 others require serious medical attention for gun assault injuries but survive, often to face life-altering trauma and wounds. We know that population of survivors is at very high risk of being shot again and killed, and relatedly, at elevated risk for involvement in retaliatory violence too. This graph, of course, doesn't capture the much larger number of people who were shot at or witnessed a shooting, who were shot but didn't require serious medical attention, or of course, the much larger ripple effects to entire families and communities when shootings occur. I also wanted to start with a specific reference to mass shootings, which dominate a lot of media and public coverage about gun violence. Mass shootings have become more frequent and higher casualty on average across the United States. A majority of the 10 deadliest shootings in modern American history have occurred just since 2016. There's a strong link between domestic violence and mass shootings, as well as other interpersonal violence. In about 2/3 of mass shootings, the shooter either had a history of domestic violence and or killed a family member or intimate partner in their attack. Many mass shootings have also been motivated by conspiracies or hateful ideologies perpetrated as hate crimes or acts of political violence. It's also important to emphasize that mass shooting deaths, in their broadest definitions, encompassing both public and residential mass shootings in the home, represent about 3% of all U.S. gun homicides, underscoring the enormous societal impact of gun violence in our country. Tens of thousands of shootings that never make the news. So I want to zoom out and have some comparative analysis. This graph shows per capita gun death rates of the last 30 years in California and the rest of the nation. California in orange, the rest of the nation per capita on average in blue. So as you can see, over the long term, we've made substantial progress in the state of California. And in fact, just before the pandemic in 2019, set an all-time record low gun death rate, as far back as CDC records go, over half a century. We can see that California is not immune to some of the broader national trends, like the spikes during the pandemic. We experienced the same weather, the same headwinds, but we're also growing in a different direction. 2023 data I'll present is very preliminary, will be adjusted, but suggests that we are fast getting back to our pre-pandemic lows. This graph shows firearm homicide rates, where the trends are similar but even more dramatic. 30 years ago, California had the third highest gun homicide rate out of all 50 states. It's important to keep that in mind when we talk about our state's progress. We were coming down from a very, very high and abnormally, atypically high. We didn't actually become meaningfully safer than the rest of the country until about a decade ago. California set its all-time low for gun homicides in 2014 and 2019, and appears to be approaching that as we move forward in 2023. This shows the same gun homicide rates, but broken down just for youth under 25. As you can see, we made even more significant sustained progress, especially from 2006 through 2023, almost uninterrupted except for the pandemic, almost uninterrupted year-by-year reductions in gun homicide rates for this age group. 2019 record lows. It appears that 2023 data, while provisional, is again approaching those record lows. This is also an area where the rest of the country has been rowing in a different direction. From 2006 to 2022, we cut gun homicide rates in half in California. So the rest of the country saw a nearly 40% increase. Same information here, but for homicide rates for children under 15. This is a population where a majority of homicides are perpetrated as family violence. You may not know it from reading the news, twice as many minors are killed in their homes in domestic violence shootings than in school shootings. And the majority of children are killed by their parents. The blue line shows an enormous increase during the pandemic in these domestic violence related, largely domestic violence or disproportionately domestic violence related child homicides. Thanks to California's domestic violence and gun violence prevention policies, we saw some increases during the pandemic, but managed to avoid many tragedies and the really truly tragic rates of increase seen across the rest of the United States on average. Similarly, for female gun homicide victims, a majority of female homicides in this country are perpetrated either by a family member or a current or former intimate partner. So the connection between domestic violence and gun violence is very close here. Again, California's domestic violence and gun violence prevention policies likely helped divert some of the enormous increases in gun homicides seen for female victims during the pandemic. So one way of putting all this data in context is to ask, what if? What if the blue line was where the orange line is? If the rest of the nation had California's gun death rate in the past decade, there would have been 140,000 fewer firearm-related deaths in a single decade. Hundreds of thousands fewer gunshot injuries requiring serious medical attention. Not a lot of headlines are written about all those shootings that didn't happen, and California's progress is incomplete, but effective implementation of gun violence prevention legislation and policy has made a world of difference for tens of thousands of families. And plus, there's a question from Ms. Rummel.
A quick question. You've shown us the homicide rates, California versus the nation. Are the gun violence rates similar? Is there a similar pattern in just overall gun violence as there is in the homicide rates?
Meaning non-fatal interpersonal shootings or including
Right,
gun
non-fatal
suicide?
shootings.
So a challenge there, and this may be surprising, is that at the national level, we do not collect in a reliable manner non-fatal shooting outcome data. We're lucky to live in a state in California where the Department of Public Health does collect information about non-fatal shootings requiring emergency department care or hospitalization that is not available at the stage at the national level. So in terms of state-by-state comparisons, we're left to look at fatal outcomes.
Is there
Following up, sorry, Heidi, go ahead.
Is there any reason to think it's different, or would you expect it to follow the same pattern?
I'd expect it to, in terms of interpersonal shootings, expect it to follow the same pattern. We can also look at fatal outcomes regarding suicide, other forms of gun violence, suicide, unintentional shootings, but expect it to largely follow the same pattern. There may be some variation based on essentially the effectiveness and success of the health systems in saving people's lives when they are shot, but that tends to be within a relatively narrow band.
Thank you.
Member Brian.
Yeah. And is this the end of the presentation, Ari? I don't want to cut you off, but you're still going.
I have more slides, but happy to answer any questions.
Just curious about one that was a little while back. The justifiable or legal, is that self-defense? Is that exclusively law enforcement shootings? I noticed that if that is law enforcement shootings, they're the most accurate at killing people when they shoot. Is that what that said there? Basically, 40% of the time you get shot by in a justifiable way, whatever that means, you're likely to die.
So that was, I could go back to that graph. So this presents data as classified by the Department of Public Health based on mortality records. So if it was either a civilian or a law enforcement shooting that was classified as a homicide, it would be reflected as a homicide or assault. If it was a rule justifiable, whether it was perpetrated or committed shot, the person holding the weapon was law enforcement or a civilian, that would be reflected as justifiable. So it's the way the legal system classified that.
Is it safe to say then that the legal justifiable is almost exclusively law enforcement? I mean, self-defense, I guess, would be in there, but that's a very small firearm use, isn't it?
I would have to go back and look at the data. I do believe a majority of those shootings are by law enforcement, but I don't know that for certain based on the public health department data there.
No worries. I was just curious because that accuracy is kind of off the charts outside of self-harm.
So, of course, we were talking about long-term progress, but also there were really significant increases during the pandemic. We saw record nationwide spikes in gun murders during the pandemic, in California too. There were 99 gun homicides in February 2020, 199 by January 2021. An important factor is that this occurred alongside a record surge in gun sales. So this shows estimates based on the number of legally sold firearms in the state of California over the pandemic, record surges beginning in the very first months of the pandemic that didn't really abate for over a year and a half. And of course, that only includes legally sold guns. It doesn't account for the ghost gun crisis. So I think it's important to acknowledge that the pandemic spike in violence was fueled by an exponential growth in the ghost gun industry, which exploited perceived loopholes in our penal code definitions of the word firearm itself to brazenly market skip the background check, anonymous access to untraceable, nominally unfinished gun kits and related products that fueled the devastating ghost gun crisis. We'll be releasing a report on this subject later this summer. It will note that, among other things, from 2019 to 2021, ghost guns accounted for at least 2/3 of the overall increase in crime gun recoveries in the state of California. Our state enacted really important nation-leading legislation to reform the ghost gun industry in recent years. Many of those most important provisions took effect in the middle of 2022, and we start to see some early but very positive indications that these efforts have begun to slow and reverse the proliferation of ghost guns and crime in our state. So we know that during the pandemic, a lot more people were acquiring guns legally and otherwise. And perhaps unsurprisingly, we saw some very substantial increases in misuse of those weapons. So this shows on the left the number of 911 calls, other calls for help from domestic violence survivors reporting they were attacked or threatened with guns. There was a 2% increase in overall calls for assistance from domestic violence survivors in the pandemic, 80% increase in the number of those calls referencing attacks with guns. This is especially concerning because we know that the presence of a gun in an abusive situation is so often the difference between life and death. Studies comparing males who committed non-fatal intimate partner violence to those who committed intimate partner murder found that the abusive partner's direct access to guns was the leading risk factor for homicide. It explained by a factor of 11 the difference between non-fatal and fatal outcomes. We put out a report last month emphasizing the fact that California has a uniquely broad array of 9 civil and criminal court protection orders that include firearm provisions. The gun violence restraining order is the only one that mentions the words gun violence in the formal name of the order, but all of these protection order processes empower someone to go into a court, present evidence that someone else is a danger to them or to others, and get a court protection order that can include a set of safety rules that include firearm restrictions. These processes place some significant responsibilities on courts and law enforcement for implementation and enforcement. But I think it's important to note that they provide an important alternative and parallel to criminal justice system responses in alignment with this commission's goals. A protection order's purpose and design is not to punish past conduct, but to protect against future harms through a set of safety rules and requirements that mitigate risk and restrict harmful conduct without incarceration. They play a vital role in gun violence prevention in our state. I want to take a moment to look at the data regarding shooting survivors in California. As we talked about before, for every 1 person killed in a gun homicide, about 3 others survive and require serious medical attention for their injuries. Nearly 90% of these survivors are male. The vast majority are Black or Hispanic or Latino. 16% are under 20, 36% are in their 20s, 26% in their 30s, 21% age 40 or over. Two things are true at the same time. The highest risk age group tends to be upper teens, low 20s, and a majority of those shot by someone else in the state are not in that age group. So we want to make sure that we don't focus only on youth violence prevention, that we focus on all people at highest risk, regardless of age. About half of those hospitalized had to be hospitalized for 5 days or more. And it's important to note that Medi-Cal is the expected health insurer for a large majority of those hospitalized or treated in emergency departments. The vast majority are publicly insured or uninsured, which again underscores the fact that people with lower income, socioeconomic status, and wealth are at vastly higher risk of gun violence exposure and trauma. These gun assault survivors are at extremely elevated risk of being shot again and killed. So one statewide study found that compared to California's statewide average, gun homicide rate in California was over 60 times higher for people who had previously survived one shooting, over 120 times higher for people who had survived multiple. A study from a trauma center in Oakland found that gun homicide was not just the leading cause of death, but the cause of death for nearly 80% of gun assault patients who survived one initial shooting, were discharged from the hospital, and then died within 5 years. Of all the people patched up thanks to the marvels of modern medicine, sent right back into the community after a shooting, 80%, nearly 80% of those who died within 5 years were killed in a subsequent shooting. There are effective strategies for connecting this vulnerable survivor population with a series of supports that promote their safety, trauma recovery, and well-being, as you'll hear about in panels later today. These programs make it less likely that survivors or their loved ones will resort to retaliatory violence too. But a 2019 report estimated that just 3% of gun assault survivors in our state received those services. Since that 2019 study, the state, local, and federal levels, we have started to make some really vital new investments in community violence prevention programs that serve these and other individuals at highest risk, especially through the Break the Cycle of Violence Act, or CALVIP, California Violence Intervention and Prevention Grant Program. Launched in 2017, codified with new funding in 2019, and then received a really substantial 3-year investment starting in 2021. But the 3-year investment was actually packaged together, awarded in 2 rounds of grants in 2022. The shorthand version of that is that California invested more in community violence intervention in 2022 than in its previous history combined. And that's created a lot of new effective opportunities for intervention, replicating best practices, and launching new programs around the state. My final slide I want to emphasize is the governor signed AB 28 last year. So this is the Gun Violence Prevention and School Safety Act, which will permanently fund CALVIP grants starting next year, as well as a range of other gun violence prevention programs. Funded out of a newly established gun violence prevention and school safety special fund, supported by a new excise tax on firearm industry retailers. Barring litigation barriers, this funding stream is estimated to generate over $1.5 billion in investments in gun violence prevention over the next decade, and will provide incredible opportunities to build more coordinated and permanent programming in areas of highest need for community violence intervention, firearm relinquishment programs, youth mental health, homicide and shooting clearance rates, and victim services. So that concludes my presentation, and I appreciate the opportunity to be with you, and happy to answer any other questions.
Thank you, Ari. Before anybody jumps in with questions, in an effort to keep us on schedule, because Ari is going to be joining us in the next few panels, I'm going to keep I hope that the committee members reserve questions for Ari during those panels, just so we can keep the progress going. Ari, that was a really helpful presentation. It was great. I just want to keep us going. Hold on, I'm delayed a second. All right, hopefully that helps. All right, now we're going to begin our panel discussions, and I want to thank each of our panelists for sharing their insights with the committee today. Okay, as is our custom, we'll give each panelist 5 minutes. I'm going to be tough on this. We have a long day, and we really need to, the best part and most helpful part of the discussion is the discussion part of our meeting. So I will cut you off after 5 minutes. Please keep your comments to 5 minutes or less, and we'll reserve the rest of the time for Q&A. Please, panelists, please know that if you have given us a written submission, we have read it. So in your opening remarks, please move quickly to the high points so we can move on to the conversation, which I said is the most productive and informative part of the conversation. All right, with that said, here are panelists for our first panel today. David Muhammad, can you promote them, Tommy?
Yes. You can keep going, Mike. I
All
think
right. Waiting for David.
he's there.
Hi, David.
Hey, how's it going, man?
Long time no see. So David
Yeah.
Muhammad is the executive director of the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform. He and I go way back. Reagan Cunningham is a co-director of California Partnership for Safe Communities. Mike McLively is policy director of the Gifford Center for Violence Intervention, excuse me. And Kathy Lester is the chief of police in Sacramento. With that very brief introduction, Mr. Muhammad, would you kick us off for 5 minutes, please?
Sure. Good morning. Good to be with you all today. I want to thank Ari. I'm going to resist, Michael, with all of your time thing. I'm going to resist trying to add a bunch of stuff to what Ari said, which I thought was great. But I will just say two things, since this is a committee around improving policy of penal code. The non-fatal shooting issue is real, despite the fact that hospitals report you still have many police departments in California that do not distinguish non-fatal shootings from other assaults. That's something that needs to change. Second is the clearance rates are certain. I know that the AB 28 is trying to support that, but the clearance rates are a problem around the country and also in California and need to have better focus. So I just want to I have way more to say about areas because it was a great presentation, but I'll just stop there. Just briefly, I want to share, and you'll hear more of this from my esteemed colleagues who are on the panel, who thankfully we have the opportunity to present together a lot. I don't know if that was the intention, but and so I'll just really make two primary points. One is when we're talking about gun violence, we really need to understand what we're trying to achieve but what time horizon. One of the huge problems in this field is we talk about each of these buckets interchangeably, and that becomes some of the frustration with the outcomes. And so we might talk for years in this country, prevention got all of the funding, and community transformation got all of the discussion in barbershops and beauty salons and town hall meetings. And not until recently was there any focus on intervention. Yes, in the last few years, there's been better focus on intervention. Some erroneously think that there's been too much discussion on intervention. But historically, youth development, mentoring, which are great, right? I used to run something called the Mentoring Center many years ago. But we need to understand that that is prevention. As Ari's data begin to show, and I just want to really emphasize, the vast majority of people involved in gun violence in this country and in California are adults. The vast majority of people involved in gun violence, victim and suspect, are adults. So if your program is focused on 15-year-olds, then we can't say that it's going to have a massive impact soon on gun violence. Nothing wrong with that program, right? Just understanding the time horizon specifically around gun violence. Community transformation, which I happen to be very interested in, I just don't do work there, is around transforming neighborhoods. So we don't need a violence intervention program. But as it relates to violence intervention, the short way to think about this is if we want to stop gun violence now, we have to work with people who are involved with gun violence now. And we now know that there are ways to identify those individuals who are at the very highest risk of gun violence and have effective intervention with those individuals. And I'll just really end my open comments with this graph. Reagan, who you'll hear from, her and I worked together for many years in Oakland, and now work in other cities around the country. And the strategy that was developed over time and implemented very successful until the horrible COVID pandemic, where the strategy really dissolved, starts with an analysis of gun violence. And so in Oakland, we had a special fund, which is by itself a great example of a locally funded, a taxpayer approved measure to fund local violence intervention efforts. But prior to the assessment of gun violence in Oakland, you could not serve anybody over the age of 24 with those funds. Then a gun violence problem analysis was conducted that showed the average age of a homicide suspect was 28 years old. One of the many reasons that you ought to understand the dynamics and the drivers of gun violence. then to have a law enforcement review of shootings very frequently, not about, the investigative process, which that needs to happen, but this is around which of these shootings have a likelihood of retaliation and who are we going to focus intervention and enforcement as it relates to stopping the retaliatory cycle. Providing that information, say for the enforcement information, providing that information to violence intervention workers, and having them have what we call specificity and intensity. And this is the difference with this type of work, is not just serving anybody, not just having a broad reentry program, nothing wrong with that, but to really say we're going to specifically focus on the people at highest risk, and we're going to do so in an intensive manner. Ironically, Michael, I'll end with this example that I give all the time about our old shop. Right. So the Anti-Recidivism Coalition, which is an extraordinary organization that I had the incredible pleasure of being the executive director of and then serve on the board. It's a reentry program to stop people from going back to prison. But the vast majority of people who get out of prison will never shoot anyone. But the vast majority of people who shoot people have been to prison. Could be a head scratcher. But the point is the specificity, to specifically focus on those individuals who are at the very highest risk. That is different than just a general reentry program, right? And to do so in an intensive way, to engage them every single day, and to do so very intensively, and to do so with somebody who has credibility with them, who has been trained, not just anybody who's just been to prison or been from the neighborhood. That is good, but then also trained to engage them intensively over time, to text with them every day, to see them 3-4 times a week for 18 months. And so I'll just, and then focus, and I'm sure Reagan will get into some of these other pieces. I just want to point out, sorry,
David, I want to cut you off just in fairness to everybody else.
Yep.
We'll get to this. It's really helpful when we get sort of mix it up in the conversation. So
yep.
Want to keep
and this was the last thing I wanted to show. You could see more than here. So yes, thank you. I'll take this down.
Good. Right. Thank you. Ms. Cunningham.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. As Michael mentioned, my name is Reagan Cunningham. I'm the co-director of the California Partnership for Safe Communities. And essentially what we do is that we help cities reduce gun violence in the near term. And we work from this kind of theory of a triple bottom line. And so what that means is, again, reducing gun violence in the near term, reducing the recidivism rate, and building community police trust. I want to build on a lot of what my colleague David mentioned, and also Ari, we've all worked together for years. So the paper that I submitted to the committee really focuses on strategies, and strategies are great. There have been some strategies that have been out there for several decades. Some are a little bit newer, but at the end of the day, despite having these strategies, most of the time at the city level, if we look nationwide, we see that a lot of times these strategies are unsuccessful. And so the question is, why is that? And in the work that we do, and we work throughout California, Oakland, San Francisco, Bakersfield, but we also work in other cities like Baltimore, as well as working with David in Indianapolis and in Mexico City. And so in doing this work over many years, we began to kind of look at why is that? We have these strategies, they have been evaluated, there were some newer strategies at the table, that's great. But if that's the case, and going to actually Ari's point in his presentation, why are we not seeing these declines nationally? And even if we look in California, why are there some cities in California that continue or have historically struggled with gun violence? And so one of the things that we had an opportunity to study through some funding from Pew Charitable Trust was we actually interviewed people who have helped to reduce gun violence in cities, as well as doing literature reviews across several topic areas to include political science, public health, criminology, etc. And what we found was that there are 6 key capacities that we found, and again, this requires further study, but we looked at what are the things that essentially matter the most in reducing gun violence, regardless of the strategy or strategies that cities choose, because most cities actually implement multiple strategies. And we found there are 6 things. One is political governance and public sector leadership, and I'll go into these in a little bit more detail, but I just want to get them on the table. A data-informed problem analysis, and this is what David was talking about, is that A lot of times in cities, we assume we know who's at highest risk of violence, but you actually need to study that to figure out what that is for your particular city. Cross-sector collaboration on a shared strategy, effective operational management, robust violence reduction infrastructure, and lastly, sustainability planning and institutionalization. So let me go to political governance and public sector leadership. So what that means, again, what we're talking about is citywide level reductions, not a reduction in a neighborhood for a particular, maybe for a year, but how do you get reductions citywide? So when we look at political governance and public sector leadership, it needs to be the top priority and a public commitment made to the community by a mayor or city administrator, depending on the type of government that you have. So that's what we mean by political governance and public sector leadership. In fact, in a lot of cities that we go into and work with, if the mayor and or city administrator is not on board with the strategy, we're not going to work there because it's not going to work without the leadership at the top. The other thing is, folks have mentioned before, is a data-informed problem analysis. This is critical, and I'll say this because I actually ran the Oakland strategy from 2011 until 2018. For years, in many cities across California, and Oakland is not unique, we assumed we knew who was at the highest risk of violence. And largely that assumption is informed by the media. And what we found is that we were wrong. And our investments were tied to a population who was not at highest risk. To David's point, and this is not unique to Oakland, this is we've seen nationwide, the demographic who was at highest risk of gun violence in Oakland, in fact, in many cities across the country, are adults, and mainly actually older adults. And what I mean by older is that the average age can be between 26 and in some cases 34. So knowing that and understanding what is driving violence in your community is important. Some communities, it can be gang and group violence. Other communities, it could be more folks with mental health issues, et cetera. Then the cross-sector collaboration on a shared strategy. Basically, it's bigger than any one entity or department. And so it has to be a shared citywide strategy. The other thing is effective operational management. You have to have a team that's going to do this work. And that includes an effective CVI team, as well as a functional and operational police department who's willing to partner. The other thing is robust violence reduction infrastructure. Again, going back to that CVI ecosystem is critically important because folks who are at the highest risk may have different needs. And lastly, sustainability planning and institutionalization. And what that means is permanent funding, a lot of times, especially for CVI work, evaluation, some type of shared governance, and the ability to make this into citywide policy as opposed to a boutique program. I know that was a lot of words, but I'm hoping that's helpful to inform our conversation today.
They absolutely will. Thank you for keeping in the time limit. I appreciate it. Mr. McLively.
Hey, good morning, everybody. I'm starting a timer here, Mike, so I will cut myself off after 5 minutes. You don't have to do it, but it's great to be with you. I'm going to share my screen. I have just a couple of slides here, so let me attempt to get this going. All right, there. Hopefully everybody can see that. So thank you again. I'm Mike McLively. I'm the policy director of the Giffords Center for Violence Intervention. Just for context, Giffords is a national gun violence prevention organization. We are named after, founded by former Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords, who was shot in 2011. Many people will remember that while hosting an event for her constituents at a supermarket in Tucson, Arizona. So we work in all 50 states, but we have an especially strong presence in California. Many of us in the organization were formerly part of the Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence, including Director Freilich, who mentioned that earlier. And we've been doing that work for decades in California to reform and improve our gun safety laws in this state, and have been very successful with that. And relevant to this conversation is our center helped create and helps run, and several of the other panelists here are members of the CalVIP Coalition. And so this is a group that's grown to include now dozens of organizations, hundreds of individuals who are practitioners, advocates, all focused on improving resources and the state's policy around supporting community violence intervention work. And again, relevant to this conversation is we are in the process right now of gathering information from our membership about the CalVIP process to find out what's working, what's not working, to inform our advocacy for next year. So we'll certainly share the results from that. We're going to be doing a survey and then focused interviews with our membership. In prior years, this has led to some pretty significant reforms, including last year legislation that eliminated a match requirement for CalVIP, that requires a minimum of 25% upfront reimbursement. So we're looking at how the system is working, not just ensuring that the dollars are there, but that they're being used effectively. And then, as I already mentioned earlier, a highlight from last year was the passage of AB 28. This is the nation's first state-level tax on the firearm industry to fund violence intervention prevention programs. So that went into effect on July 1st, and I'll just flag for the committee that an NRA lawsuit was filed the day after on July 2nd. So that is now going to be in play in the court system, and we'll see what happens with that. But there's a possibility that the funding is paused while litigation is settled. So just wanted to flag that. And our team has a very robust litigation department that will be working to support the defense of that law. Really quickly, I want to talk about a few recommendations that were in our written submissions and just some high-level points, and then I'll wrap up. And the first is that there's this very strong connection between gun policy and especially the enforcement of illegal gun possession and incarceration rates. This is true nationally, and it's true in California as well. As of a few years ago, 40,000 inmates in California had some form of gun-related enhancement as part of their sentence. 80% of those individuals were Black or Latinos, who are definitely seeing a disparate impact on communities of color. And I think really the most important point here is something David said earlier and Ari has alluded to, that and Reagan as well, in every city that we look at with higher rates of community violence, it's a very small percentage of individuals that are causing the vast majority of shootings. And so an assumption that anyone who's carrying a gun is going to be using that gun to commit violence is incorrect and should not be the basis of our policy response to gun possession. And so that has a lot of consequences for public policy, obviously. We looked at this at a report for the federal government a few years ago, but we've seen attempts nationally and attempts at the state level to dramatically ratchet up enforcement of gun possession. And again, this is different from use. I'm not talking about homicides or shootings. I'm talking about just carrying a gun when you're not allowed to be carrying a gun. And when that has been ratcheted up, as it was nationally in the early 2000s, as it was in Illinois from 2014 to 2019, we have not seen corresponding decreases in gun violence as a result of those changes, but we have seen lots of people going to prison, which we know also creates and is one of the drivers and core causes of gun violence. It's incarcerating folks. So that is important to keep in mind. So 3 recommendations, I'll say them in 30 seconds. One is we need more research on this issue. This report that was done for Illinois, would love to see the same thing done in California, taking a very close look at how we are enforcing our gun possession laws, who is impacted by them, and what changes can be made to improve them. The second is gun diversion programs. These are just starting to proliferate in the country. We did a very large report on a program in Minneapolis. There are a few others, but California has not taken the lead on this, and we would love to see more investment in pilot programs to incentivize prosecutors to allow these gun diversion programs as an alternative to incarceration. And then finally, was mentioned earlier, homicide solve rates. AB 28 includes some money for this, but we really need to do a better job in particular cities in California, improving our solve rates, especially for non-fatal shootings. There are very concrete policies that can improve that. We just need to put funding and resources towards making that happen. And with that, I will wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you. Good on time. Chief Lester.
Good morning.
Morning. Thank you. There you are. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.
Sure. Okay. I guess I'm the end user here of all these policies and the data. So I will not reiterate or repeat a lot of what we've heard today. I agree with all of it. We know a lot about urban violence. There's been a lot of studies on this for a long time, and that's actually a benefit to us at the local, state, and federal level when you're actually trying to drive down violence. I'll paint the picture here in Sacramento because it's really the experience that I have with this. I've been here for about 30 years. We saw a dramatic increase, not a surprise to anyone during the pandemic, in gun-related violence, in particular domestic violence, as well as homicides and non-fatal shootings. If you look across the United States, overall, homicides went up about 30 to 36% in major cities, and felony assaults with firearms went up about 20%. But here in Sacramento, we saw about a 70% increase in homicides and over a 40% increase in felony assault. So it was really significant coming in. So one of my first priorities as chief, and I've been here, seeing how the thing, our department has been built and know our community very well, which is the strength, was that we had to bring those numbers down. And based on the research and what we know about violence, we do know that violence, especially urban violence, is committed by very few individuals in very specific geographic areas. And so we started doing a data dive into Sacramento and not using the traditional statistics, but actually looking at microgrids within the city. What we found was actually surprising to all of us. Our city is about 100 square miles, but we were able to isolate the majority of our violence to about 7 square miles. And if you actually take that down and take your vacant spaces out of it, it's about 5 square miles. And we had about 600 shootings in 2021. So there's about 600, not necessarily unique individuals. So that's a starting point in a city like ours of over 500,000. We first turned to BJA's VCROG, the Violent Crime Reduction Operations Guide, because it's a very comprehensive approach to developing a gun reduction strategy or a violence reduction strategy. And based on that, we started to build out what our strategy looked like. I'm a student of Braga, which a lot of you know Anthony Braga's work in Boston, what he did with ceasefire. We had actually a number of years ago replicated a ceasefire program here, and it wasn't as successful as you would have thought, kind of to Reagan's point, where we have a difficult time duplicating programs from city to city. They have to be very, I think, customized for the city that you work in. And so, what we knew is that the police department can't solve this problem alone. And we've tried to for a long time, I'll be frank, and I'll go back, 30 years ago when I started, when we had an issue of violence in a neighborhood, we would saturate the neighborhood. A lot of people got stopped. A lot of people went to jail. And that's hugely problematic because you create major issues of trust and inequity in those neighborhoods. And so we wanted to be very strategic about how we developed and implemented a violent crime reduction strategy. During the development of this strategy, we had a really unique and terrible, tragic situation here in Sacramento. If you're from California, as many of you are, we had the 10th and K shooting. It was a bar shooting in downtown Sacramento, a block north of the Capitol, where 18 people were shot and 6 people were ultimately killed. And, even now, the number of rounds that were fired in that incident and is even a shock to me. And it was really, a horrible tragedy, but we used it as an opportunity to really bring the topic of gun violence to the forefront with our electeds and with our community. And it was one point where you really have synergy between your community partners as well as your electeds. Everyone was behind trying to stop this issue. What we know is that it's not, we need our community partners to help us with this. And when you're looking at 600 unique individuals, if you start diving into their histories, there's a lot of commonalities that you see. And so we, here in Sacramento, we are very lucky because we have a big enough city that it's a big city, but it's small enough that everyone kind of knows each other. And we've worked with a lot of community-based organizations for a number of years that do great work in the community, but we've never really tied them all together. So we were able to get funding. And since then, we've actually extended the funding to multi-year funding, which I think is really important for CBOs. They're not jumping from grants from year to year. It's very hard to affect sustainable change. We've developed a strategic enforcement plan. We're also the recipient of a PSP grant, which is the public safety partnership that brings in our federal partners and use really intelligence-driven policing. With our community partners, we've asked them essentially to do 3 things. As many of you know, we've had a number of interruptions, especially during the pandemic, with youth and youth that have overtaken shopping centers, that are engaged in big smash and grab thefts and robberies. And we knew that we needed to engage with those individuals and especially youth. So we've asked our CBOs to be really on the forefront. So it's not necessarily a law enforcement interaction in managing and working with these problems. We've also, because we know what an impact gun violence has to our community, it's not just the people that are directly involved, the people that have been shot, their family, the people that saw it, the entire neighborhood is affected, the entire community. And so when you survey and when you go and you do research in a lot of our really tough neighborhoods, you find that there's a generalized fear of violence. A lot of youth are carrying guns, not necessarily to use them because they're afraid of, the situation that they're in. And you have a lot of trauma in our communities. And so you have to be very cognizant of that. So we bring our CBOs out to certainly try and do intervention. And then the biggest part is that really strategic intervention with people that have the propensity to be a shooter. And that's a very small group, and that's very specific work by trained individuals that we know. So we do a lot of referrals from our patrol division, our specialized units to our community-based organizations so that we can work with individuals. I'll wrap it up. In the end, after our first year and a half of developing this strategy, we were able to bring our homicide rate down by 40%, our shootings down by 30%. And this year we're kind of on par with homicide. We're about equal to last year, but we've still reduced shootings about 20 additional percent. That's still too many. When you look at 2021, we had 250 people shot in our city. In 2022, the reduction came down to, just over 170. That's still 170 people getting shot in your city. And there's a huge equity issue there. If you look at the victims of shootings any month, any given time, anywhere between about 60 and 80% of our victims are primarily Hispanic or African American males, typically younger males, but not necessarily youth. I mean, we can talk about younger adult males, and I think that's a very important point that's been made. We put a lot of money and resources to youth, and we're missing a big group that really needs some additional assistance. So with that, I'll end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chief, and to everybody. Again, I'm having delay. Hold on one second. All right, hopefully that helped. We've about half an hour left for a conversation amongst all of us to try to help us understand and make recommendations around the policies that we've been discussing. I think the panelists and plus Ari, you've given us incredible amount of background information and data and really good picture of the landscape, and I certainly have learned a ton. Here's a constraint that I'd like everybody to focus on for the next half hour when we get to work for our purposes, which is that we make recommendations to the legislature on policies to amend the penal code, right? So many of the things that we've talked about, that you've talked about, I should say, over the past 20 minutes, half hour, are funding related, implementation related, community specific related. Not saying that they're not important. Totally get that they're important, and we want to try to help facilitate them. But in order to make our work as effective as possible, I'm hoping that for the next bit, we can focus on statewide penal code recommendations that you think might help further advance the success, it sounds like, the incredible success that we've had. And I guess I want to start, and I kind of asked this of everybody. It's my question is kind of like, magic wand, if you could pass a law today, what would it be? And I guess I would start with Ari, getting back for your presentation about seeing what a dramatic decrease or improvement in gun violence we've seen in California and perhaps throughout the country. Is there a specific policy that you think has been stand out, the most effective? And question number two is, again, magic wand, if you could pass a law in California to continue the momentum or to improve the issues that we've been talking about, what would that be?
I think I'm going to have an unsatisfying answer because I'm going to fight the hypothetical a bit. It's a lot of laws working together that have kind of knit a lot of threads together that provide a safety net that we're building on. And it is very difficult to understate the importance of the investments in violence intervention. We've been operating from a place of scarcity for so long that I think has motivated a lot of policy in this space. I think this is accurate. The talking point I remember from 2017 was the budget, California's budget for the San Francisco Public Library's IT budget was higher than our state's investment in community violence intervention. And so the magic wand for me for a long time has been, we need to solve the funding scarcity problem to build the foundation, the opportunity to actually make long-term planning, sustained planning, strategic long-term planning, instead of one-year pilot program approaches in one neighborhood where 6 individuals are tasked with solving violence for a city of 1 million. I think all the other panelists would actually be better situated to speak to that. But so I will say, maybe this is technical, but the CalVIT program is in the penal code. There have been a number of amendments made last year to it. And it also, it provides a pathway for set-aside funding. Set-aside funding for building out technical assistance, coordination at the state level. The first level, you know, I think much of us were motivated by let's get funding out the door. The pandemic was, there was a fire out there, just get funding out the door. Let's build this funding stream, get funding out the door to programs that are needing it most to address this current crisis. And I think there's been less of a prioritization so far in terms of building out what does a state level sustained coordinated support system look like for that work. And so in terms of community violence intervention, just to wrap up, I think the next step is to implement the funding streams, preserve AB 28, ensure that that funding stream continues through the penal code, funding programs through the penal code, and continuing to refine, I think that all the other panelists have talked about many ways to do this, what it looks like for the state to coordinate this work in, you know, across a very large, broad state with a lot of different strategies. What would it look like for the state to provide more leadership in supporting the development and success of those programs?
Thanks. Mr. McLively, I just wanted to follow up on something that I think I heard you say. I just want to make sure that I understood it properly.
Sure.
You're talking about that many people carry guns for, I guess, self-protection and not necessarily to commit crimes. And that in particular, there was one state, I forget what you mentioned, that said that we are going to dramatically increase the penalties for just merely carrying a gun, but that had no impact on public safety overall. So is your suggestion, and again, I really do appreciate and understand that funding is at the core of all of this, and but is it your suggestion or recommendation to look at enhancements, or fundamental crimes that focus on merely possessing a gun and perhaps reducing those punishments because they don't improve public safety and they have the racially disparate impacts that you were suggesting? Is that what you were getting at? I just wanted to make sure. I
Yeah,
understood.
yeah, 100%. And you know, we don't specialize, at least at this point, in sentencing at that level of specificity, but I think that's where you all and your mission can take that and carry it. But certainly, I think there's been progress, it seems like, over the last years in California to increase judicial discretion with those enhancements. But I think there's more to do there. And so, yes, it's a short answer. I think that's what we're recommending.
So mere possession of a firearm, you're saying, is not necessarily a danger to public safety.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the data shows that.
Chief Lester, and then I want to open up to the rest of my panelists. I wonder if you share that sentiment.
You know, I know what the data shows. What I think we've seen over the last number of years, and this is anecdotal, people have a really hard time with emotional control and impulse control. And I've seen that surge.
Can't you see with my 1-minute timer that I have a problem with that? I'm sorry.
Sorry?
Bad joke. Keep on going.
Oh, sorry. No, I think that we have a lot of impulse control issues. And when you add a firearm to that mix, it can be very, very difficult to prevent crime. And like, for example, when you bring a gun to a bar in downtown Sacramento, it's too late at that point. Like, so what do we do previous to that to intervene? You know, I don't think that simply gun carrying causes you to be a shooter, but at the same time, having a gun on you, I think that there's a bigger tendency to use it, maybe when it's not necessary.
And if I could jump in here, I mean, I think we might be talking about two separate pieces, right? That I don't know if there's anybody who's arguing that there should not be a reduction of access to firearms,
right?
Right, but the point of how we punish different offenses is the point, right? So simple gun possession should be in nowhere close to assault with a gun, right? And what the data shows is simple gun possession is by its by itself is not predictive of use of that firearm. There's some incredible data out of Philadelphia alarming the amount of gun possession is one way to look at that data, but how small the number of those individuals go on 5 years or more later to be involved in an actual gun offense. And so just distinguishing that point. So yes, Mike, I knew I think I was making that, but just one quick thing before is I just want to come back to the issue of the penal code of penal code, section 241, 240, 241A, that there is need for clarity around you shoot a gun and it hits someone. There is a lack of clarity in the penal code in California around it.
I just wrote that note. I've litigated many cases around this very issue. I know exactly what you're talking about.
And one quick thing to add to that, thank you, David, for clarifying that. 100% agree with what David's saying. And all the data we looked at and been talking about for decades shows that a gun makes you less safe, not more safe. So I want to make sure I'm making that point as clearly as possible. But what David said is correct. And I didn't have time to get into it, but that case study from Minneapolis where they've implemented this gun diversion program came about because the prosecutor's office there looked at what was happening a few years out after we convicted someone for illegal possession. And they were blown away and alarmed at what they saw, which was it looked like they're actually making people more likely to commit a violent felony a few years down the line than they were if they had just done nothing. So as a result of seeing that data, they decided they needed to partner with community-based organization, offer an alternative to incarceration that involved, addressing some of the risk factors that would lead to someone actually committing an act of violence down the line, mentoring, and all the things that we've already talked about before. But it was looking at that data and the results that led to that happening in the first place. And that's what I'm getting at. Thanks.
I'm going to go Heidi first, and then Chief Lester, if you just kind of follow up on what where the conversation goes. Go ahead.
What Mike was just talking about was what I wanted to ask, given, the not astonishing, but important data that of how community-based organizations are fundamental to this effort and our role as the Committee on the Revision of the Penal Code, talking about when someone does become involved in the criminal system with gun possession or related charges, like where is the space or where is something we could do with the penal code to filter them, direct them, have effective intervention through a community-based organization? Like, what does that look like? Where has that been done successfully? So you kind of, you started down that road, and maybe Chief Lester is going to talk more about that, but I think that's an interesting space for us to explore.
Agree.
Yeah, I think that's very important. And if you look at how we respond to DUI convictions or domestic violence convictions, we have a lot of follow-up on those crimes. They're essentially, they're punitive, but they're also diversion programs. But we don't do hardly anything with just straight gun possession. The penalties are limited, but there's really no resources for people that have been convicted of those crimes. And I can't say that's why in 5 years they may go on to commit, felonies. But I know here in Sacramento, one of our community-based organizations is running a pilot program through some state money to actually do intervention post-conviction for gun possession, and essentially a series of classes, to try and address those issues. And no one's really, I think, seen that or done that before. And I think if the Penal Code Committee is looking at a change, I think that could be hugely helpful to, limit further involvement and to actually really help people.
I'd love to hear suggestions from some of the CBO people about where you think, if that's your opportunity. I think there are better ways to engage with people who are likely to carry guns or use guns. But if the criminal system is your opportunity to engage with someone, what's the best way? How should that look, or how could that look that it would be productive?
What should highlight is the Minneapolis program conducted a risk assessment of each person that was coming through, because some percentage of people.
Could you describe, Mike? Could you describe the Minneapolis program?
Sure. Yeah. And all the details are in that case study, but in a nutshell, when someone's facing a misdemeanor charge for illegal gun possession, and there were certain criteria, which I don't remember off the top of my head, but it had to be non-serious. They were offered by the prosecutor's office the ability to defer conviction and participate in this program, which was a year more or less. It was customized to each individual, but they put out an RFP, a community-based organization won that, and then did this year-long program that again involved, you know, like life skills, life coaching, mentoring, helping to understand just the basics of firearm law. That was part of the issue of why people were being arrested in the first place, was not sending in your check to get their license that you needed, that kind of thing. But really the key there was addressing some of those core issues of like employment skills, building a resume, like those types of things. And then there'd be a graduation at the end. If you completed the program, you would not only not have a conviction at the end, but they would actually help you expunge the record of the arrest. So the idea was, you know, we're trading that none of this happened. You completed this program, you're now at lower risk, and that's the end of your process with the criminal system. Obviously, if you don't meet those conditions, there's still the possibility of trial, conviction, and all that. But that's the basics.
Let the record reflect that Senator Skinner has joined us. Good morning. It's good to see you. Tom, if I'm remembering correctly from the memo, there's nothing in California law that prevents any current county from establishing this type of diversion program, right? Like it's wide open, right? So anybody who, but the recommendation that you've suggested in the memo is that we sort of say explicitly that prosecutors may, which I think mirrors other diversion type laws, so that they may engage in this type of diversion practice. Am I recalling and reading everything correctly, Tom? Is that right?
It sounds like clarity that we've been working on for a couple of years now, Tom.
Yeah, that's right. And Rick obviously jump in too, but I think the situation is even more acute than that, which is that we have diversion for almost any misdemeanor that a judge can do over the prosecutor's objection. And a lot of these gun possession offenses are misdemeanors or can be charged as misdemeanors. And I suspect it's not happening. In fact, Rick found some in one county, the court put out a thing saying you're presumptively ineligible for misdemeanor diversion if it's gun possession. So it's not even that there's nothing preventing it. We have a law that allows it, and it looks like it isn't being used. And I think, it makes a lot of sense as we're having a whole panel today. It's very sensitive. So something that would sort of say, here's an explicit program you can do. You don't have to do it. It's based on what we've seen work in other states to some degree, might be good, and could also maybe tie into some of the, hopefully this steady stream of funding that will be coming from CalVIP as a way to fund community-based organizations to actually do it. You don't want just to be, with all due respect, it's another way for prosecutors to get money for some unspecified program. And you want it to be evidence-based and done in a way that shows the results that we're looking for.
According to my screen, Ms. Cunningham, Chief Lester, and then Professor Rummel.
Yeah, I just want to knit some of this all together.
Yeah.
I think the challenge with gun violence in California, there's a lot that California is doing, but there's a lot that we can do better. And specifically what I mean by that, instead of just looking at things piecemeal, the state really needs a multi-year strategic gun violence prevention plan to address gaps in its current approach. I do think if we look at this kind of micro issue of a diversion program, that is great. But at the end of the day, I think to Tom's point, it needs to be evidence-based. And to David's point, it needs to focus on behavior change and behavior modification. So people don't feel like they need to use guns against other people and engage in violence. But that to me is wrapped up in a larger strategic approach. And that's one of the things, going to your earlier question, of that's one of the things that I think California is missing. There are other states, and Mike can talk about this. I know Gifford's done a lot of research on this, but what is our strategic plan in California to reduce gun violence? And this is above and beyond funding. Funding is great. We continue to need funding, that's for sure. At the same time, we also need a plan to go with that funding. So it's not just funding in isolation. So that's just one of the things that I wanted to put on the table of, we can look and learn from other states about having strategic plans to reduce gun violence, which is one of the things that we don't currently have in California.
Ari, I'm assuming that's part of your job.
I think the answer is yes, but I want to be really transparent. So I'm a one-person office, and my background is not the same as Reagan's in terms of community violence intervention leadership work. And so I want to be really clear that given the budget picture, I think if the budget picture were different, I think an Office of Gun Violence Prevention would look different right now. And so I think the funding piece is tied to this statewide strategy. That's why I keep coming back to AB 28 is the medium-term plan. It's not all the funding, but it is the first step for building out that plan. But I also think there's needed conversation about, that's why I come back to the what that centralized leadership looks like for an Office of Community Violence Intervention. The Community Violence Intervention funding streams in California do not live at my department, do not live at the Department of Justice. I'm a one-person office that is trying to uplift that work and trying to shine a light on why it's important. And the agencies that actually administer those funds have the funds to invest right now in coordination and technical assistance provision. I would recommend and support more development either there or at other offices. So we have a dedicated Office of Community Violence Intervention with leadership, strategic, long-term strategy. So I don't think it's an either or, and I think it absolutely has to be part of the Office of Gun Violence Prevention, but I want to be very transparent about the limitations that I have, that our office has to be one person kind of developing that. And so moving forward, I'm hoping that there's more opportunity for exactly that. But right now, given the budget picture, I mean, I think I do keep coming back to funding in the medium term will be the first step. And we need more organizations tied together to this kind of infrastructure in the future.
So I want to get to Chief Lester and then Senator Skinner, but very quickly, yes or no, are you the only person statewide in California who's dedicated government official whose job it is to coordinate these efforts?
So CalVIP is administered through BSCC, and they have, as I understand it, individuals who manage multiple grants, including the CalVIP program. So including.
But in terms of developing a policy along the lines that Ms. Cunningham was.
I believe so.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
I should say the Department of Public Health also has an injury and violence prevention branch focused on violence prevention, injury prevention broadly as well.
All right. Thank you. Chief Lester, Senator Skinner, and then David Muhammad.
Thank you. Just to add to the conversation, I think we all agree about the importance of some type of diversion program to try and reduce recidivism, but also to try and change behavior, as Ms. Cunningham had pointed out. We have a gap there. You can create any penal code, any policy to do this, but we don't have a structure in place. We don't have consistency, and we don't have a training model or evidence-based practices or programs that are consistent across the state for implementation. And I've noticed, when working with our community-based organizations, great people, they really know the neighborhoods and the people that they work in and work with, but we are all over the board when it comes to training. If you look at the standardization for police officers, we have a whole state agency that does that, but I think a lot of our CBOs are sort of left to their own devices and their opportunities that they have. And I would love to see a state program that could bring in at least a standardization of training and certifications for those organizations to be able to do the work that we're talking about. Thank you.
Thanks. Senator Skinner?
Thanks. I unfortunately was unable to hear the beginning part, so I don't know if there was any discussion about those cities in California that, and they haven't all been maintained, but have had effective violence intervention programs. The Office of Neighborhood Services in Richmond, for example, Oakland, when it had ceasefire, I think it's going to try to start it again, but it's not currently operative. But in those communities, the data would indicate that there was that they were very effective and that they did significantly reduce the gun violence in those communities when those efforts were, fully funded and most active. So that's one thing I just wondered if we had brought up. And then, Ms. Cunningham, to your point, so I've by no means opposed in any way to a statewide plan. I just, I would like to see those states that have it, have they actually, as a result of having such a plan, has there been a significant reduction in gun violence? Because I note that California does, as imperfect as we are, we do have one of the lower rates of any state. And so I guess I feel like before we jumped into that would be the say the recommendation or the best direction for us. Do we have data that shows those states that have adopted such a plan, once they've adopted it, was there then a significant or a statistically meaningful drop in gun violence.
So let me answer the question in two ways. So yes, there are states that have adopted plans. New York is one of them, Massachusetts is another. And Giffords actually wrote a whole report on states leading in this way. Massachusetts, as I mentioned before, is another state. And but what is missing that we found in most states is a formal evaluation to see whether those programs are effective. The only evaluation that I'm aware of, and Mike, feel free to chime in here, is the one in Massachusetts called SSYI, Safe and Successful Youth Initiative, and that has been evaluated by a research partner that had positive results. So I think nationally, it's one of the things that's missing. Is I think of California as a national leader. And so as a national leader in this work, I think we can lead in this area. At the same time, we have an opportunity to learn from other states. I think there's a lot to learn from Massachusetts. At the same time, it's also a smaller state. But I do think part of that learning process is having a research partner that is looking at the work of the strategic plan for the state to see whether it's effective and also where are there ways, what opportunities are there for improvement.
So we don't necessarily have the data yet. So I just think that's something that we, obviously, and as the committee, as we think about recommendations, there is some data on the different community efforts. There have been some studies, for example, on Richmond's Office of Neighborhood Services.
I'll just add really quickly that Illinois created a statewide violence reduction plan to cover, I think, 2020 to 2024, or something like that. As far as I know, there hasn't yet been a systematic evaluation of did that cause violence to go down. Violence has gone down in Illinois. There's obviously a lot of different factors, but to your direct question, Senator Skinner, I'm not aware of a academically rigorous study that links a statewide strategic plan with reduction of violence. I do know that in Illinois, it led to the state, county, and city of Chicago all working together for the first time, and I have to think that that's had an impact, but the studies are still not there.
Hi, David.
Yep. Just quickly, a couple things. I think so. Senator Skinner, we did talk about Oakland for sure, and then the Office of Neighborhood Safety. And Richmond certainly has both have had academic evaluations showing that those initiatives very similar, focusing on the very highest risk individuals and having intensive intervention with those individuals. So I think that is right in terms of, in general, we know what can be effective, as I think Chief Lester mentioned, in the locale that has to be implemented with the specifics of that locale. In terms of this, what I would call state coordination, because there's a lot of things going on. We haven't, I don't think, talked about CalAIM in this discussion, and so AB 1929. No, I think Mike mentioned this, but and to the point of training that the chief mentioned, there is some consideration in terms of a certification and training around that. And that, I think, again, California being a leader allows for community violence intervention workers for Medi-Cal reimbursement for those workers. Again, California being a leader there, and there being some required training around that. I think we need to take that further. There is, without really making a very controversial statement, there is a great need to improve BSCC's understanding of this work and their management of it. A great need to improve. But I will also say that the CalVIP itself is an example of the evolution, both in the terms of the amount of money from 9 million to 200 is huge, but also the uses of it. And as Ari said, that is some of that is in the penal code. And although there has been a significant improvement from funding people reading to elementary school students, literally, to actually being able to fund the type of gun violence reduction strategies that are effective. But I think we go a little further around something that the city of Oakland did in its local funding to say, these funds must be focused on the people at the very highest risk of gun violence that research shows and data shows that are, and requires a evaluation research partner that Reagan talked about. And the last thing I'll just say here is what I would call a data-driven performance management process. When I heard the chief say we have goals of reducing homicides, non-fatal shootings by X, almost lost my mind in excitement. You don't unfortunately normally get that from cities and from chiefs. So I was incredibly, thank you, Chief. But to say here are, to Reagan's point of a plan, is basically say, here are the things we're doing to achieve these things and to check in, as basic as that is, we don't do that, to check in regularly on where are we on doing the things and achieving the things, right? And so if the state did that, we would be in a better place.
Terrific. We're running low on time. If there are any committee members who have any last questions? All right, Mr. McLively and Ms. Cunningham, please keep it short because we want to try to keep the rest of the
Yeah,
day
this is like a 15-second comment. I just want to say to Chief Lester's point, I think that's very right that California doesn't have necessarily best practices for specifically gun diversion, but the University of Chicago has started systematically studying the few programs that do exist around the country, and they've published a few great reports on best practices. So we've linked to that in our materials just for awareness of staff and folks. That is out there. So just wanted to flag that.
Perfect, thank you. Ms. Cunningham.
And just real quickly, when I talk about a plan, it's about scaling how the success that we've had at the local level. And I say that from a personal level. I ran this Oakland ceasefire program from 2011 to 2018. So I know what that looks like, but how do you scale that? And David has worked very intimately with us in Oakland as well as in Richmond. So how do you scale that so that the rest of the state and communities that struggle with gun violence can emulate that? And so when we talk about a plan, that's to David's point and to the chief's point, what are some standards? How do cities develop goals? What are the things we need in the state being able to guide that? So that's what we need is more like standardization of the things that we know have worked at the local level.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Mike, I don't know if you have your hand up, but we're going to keep on moving. Thank you all. We have read your submissions. Please continue to be in touch. No good deed goes unpunished. I'm sure me, staff, other members of the committee may be back in touch. And you can certainly please reach, it's open door. Please reach back out to us if things come up or, related to this or otherwise that you think that we might be helpful for. We really appreciate your time. We're going to move on to the next panel now.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good seeing you, Mike.
All right, I'm promoting folks. So you can continue, Mike, if you want.
All right, give me half a second.
No problem.
All right. We lost Heidi.
I'm sure she'll be right back.
Okay.